Tied up in a blizzard, this German shepherd's cry for help changed everything. The wind shrieked like a living beast, slashing through the frozen landscape with an unforgiving bite. Snowflakes, sharp as needles, swirled furiously, reducing the world to a blinding white abyss. Temperatures had plummeted so low that even the trees, draped in thick frost, stood silent, as if mourning the life-threatening storm that had descended upon them. Amid this merciless blizzard, a lone figure trudged forward, boots crunching against the ice-crusted ground. His breath came in heavy clouds, vanishing into the unforgiving air. At his side, a German shepherd trotted obediently, his thick coat already collecting ice, his trusting eyes fixed on the man he had devoted his life to. But the dog did not know what was coming. He did not know that the hands he had licked in loyalty were about to betray him. And he certainly did not know that, within minutes, he would be left to die in the heart of this frozen wasteland. The storm had been building all day, growing stronger with each passing hour. Now, as the sky darkened into an ominous gray, it struck with full force, burying the world beneath its fury. The icy wind howled through the barren land, carrying the weight of an impending disaster. A lone truck, its tires struggling for grip against the icy road, came to a slow halt near a cluster of skeletal trees. The headlights flickered against the thick snowfall before the engine cut off, leaving nothing but the roar of the storm. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out, tugging his coat tighter around his frame. His movements were quick, almost impatient, as if he didn't want to linger any longer than necessary. From the passenger seat, a German shepherd leaped down, his tail wagging despite the biting cold. His paws sank into the snow, but he barely noticed. He was with his owner, and that was all that mattered. The man reached into the truck and pulled out a leash. But instead of attaching it to the dog's collar for a walk or a playful run, he strode toward one of the ice-covered trees and wrapped it around the trunk. The dog stood still, ears perked up in confusion. Then, without a word, the man fastened the clasp, tightening the leash just enough so that escape was impossible. At first, the dog waited patiently. Perhaps this was just a momentary pause, a break before they moved on. His tail swayed gently, his breath fogging up in the cold air as he watched his owner step back toward the truck. But something was wrong. The man didn't look at him, didn't say a word. Instead, he turned his back and climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut with finality. The German shepherd's ears twitched. His head tilted slightly. A soft whimper escaped his throat, but he still wasn't worried. His owner would come back for him. He always did. Then the engine roared to life. The truck's tires spun for a moment before gaining traction, crunching against the snow as it started to move. The dog's tail froze mid-wag. His ears drooped. His whimpers turned to urgent barks. Confused, desperate, pleading. He pulled at the leash, straining against it, his paws scraping against the snow-covered ground. But the leather strap held firm. The truck didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The red taillights blurred into the blizzard, growing smaller and smaller, until they vanished completely. And then, there was silence. The realization struck like a blow to the chest. The German shepherd sat down, his breaths coming in quick, panicked puffs. His owner, his world, was gone. He let out a long, mournful howl, but the wind swallowed his voice before it could travel far. The snow around him deepened, creeping up his legs, turning his thick fur into a prison of ice. Still, he refused to believe it. He barked again, louder, then again, and again. Surely his owner would hear him. Surely this was a mistake. But the only answer was the relentless scream of the storm. The cold sank its teeth into his body, numbing his paws, stiffening his limbs. His ears burned from the frost, and his breaths grew heavier. The leash dug into his neck, unyielding. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. A shiver racked his body. His eyelids drooped. Was this it? Was this how it ended? But then, far in the distance, something moved. A shadow in the storm. Someone had heard him, and in that moment, his cry for help changed everything. The night was a merciless predator, sinking its icy fangs into everything it touched. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, swallowing the world in an endless white abyss. The wind shrieked, tearing through the trees like a vengeful spirit, and in the middle of it all, a lone German shepherd sat trembling, his body half buried in the snow, his breath coming out in weak, misty puffs. He had been left here, abandoned, tied to a frozen tree as the storm raged around him. His leash, once a symbol of companionship, was now a cruel tether binding him to his fate. But deep inside his shivering frame, something still fought, a flicker of defiance, a desperate, burning instinct to survive. The temperature had plummeted below freezing, turning the very air into sharp daggers that stabbed at his lungs with every breath. His thick coat, which had always shielded him from the worst of winter's bite, was now coated in frost, stiff with ice. His paws, once strong and sure, were numb and raw, barely able to dig into the snow as he shifted. The world had turned against him. The snow piled higher around his body, creeping up his legs, threatening to bury him alive. He tried to move, but his muscles were sluggish, drained of warmth. His ears twitched at every gust of wind, but there was nothing. No sound, no footsteps, no familiar voice calling his name. He whimpered softly, the sound barely audible over the howling storm. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, to fight the cold, but his body was failing him. The blizzard had no mercy. The cold was a patient predator, and it was winning. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The German shepherd's heartbeat slowed, his breath shallow, his vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges. He knew what was happening. His body was giving up, slipping toward the quiet embrace of sleep, the kind of sleep that one never wakes up from. But somewhere in the depths of his mind, a distant memory stirred, a warm hand ruffling his fur, a voice filled with love, a home, a place where he belonged. His owner, the man he had trusted more than anything. Was he coming back? Would he return, take off this leash, and whisper gentle words like he always had? The dog's eyes flickered open, his breathing quickening. No, he couldn't give up. Not yet. With the last strength he had left, he threw his head back and howled. The sound was weak at first, barely more than a whisper against the wind. But then he did it again, louder this time, more desperate. A cry that tore through the night, carrying every ounce of his fear, his pain, his will to survive. If no one came now, there would be no second chance. For a long moment, the world remained silent. His howl had been swallowed by the storm, just like all the others. But then something shifted. A faint sound, barely audible through the wind. Footsteps, slow, cautious, crunching through the snow. His ears twitched, his body stiffening. Was it real, or just a cruel trick of his fading mind? Another step, closer this time. His heart pounded as a beam of light cut through the blizzard. A flashlight, bobbing against the darkness. A shadow moved within the swirling snow. A voice, muffled but unmistakably human, called out. Someone was out there. Someone had heard him. The German shepherd let out one final, desperate whimper, his body too weak to move. But in his chest, hope flared, a small, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. This was no longer just a fight against the cold. This was the moment his life would change forever. The storm was merciless, its howls blending with the cries of a desperate soul buried in the snow. But somewhere in the distance, beyond the blinding white abyss, a pair of ears had heard what the storm tried to swallow. A sound, faint, broken, but unmistakable. A cry for help. David had been driving cautiously through the treacherous road, his truck's tires crunching against the frozen ground, when something stopped him. At first, he thought it was just the wind, another eerie whistle from the blizzard. But then, there it was again, a howl, weak, frantic, and filled with something that gripped his chest, desperation. He slowed the truck, his gloved hands tightening around the wheel. He peered through the frost-covered windshield, but all he could see was an endless curtain of snow. Still, His gut twisted with an undeniable feeling. Someone or something was out there, and it was in trouble. Without a second thought, he pulled over and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. Then, through the wailing storm, the sound came again. A whimper, a plea, and David knew he had to find it. Stepping out of the truck, David was hit with a force so brutal it nearly knocked him off balance. The cold bit at his exposed skin like 1,000 needles, and the wind screamed in his ears, urging him to turn back. But he moved forward, one cautious step at a time, his boots sinking into the thick snow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely carrying through the storm. No answer, just the relentless howling wind. Then movement. A shadow flickered between the flurries of snow. He squinted against the storm, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. And there, half buried in the drifts, he saw it. A dog. David's breath hitched. The German shepherd lay motionless, its body curled up against the brutal cold. Ice clung to its fur, its paws raw from struggling. But the worst part? The leash. The dog was tied to the tree, left to die in the middle of the storm. David's jaw clenched as rage burned in his chest. Someone had done this. Someone had left him here. But he wasn't too late. Not yet. David stumbled forward, his knees sinking into the snow as he reached the dog. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice softer now, urgent but careful. He placed a hand on the dog's side, cold. Too cold. But then a shudder, a faint rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive. The dog's eyes fluttered open, glassy and filled with exhaustion. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, the shepherd let out the softest sound. A broken whimper, as if he couldn't believe someone had finally come. David swallowed hard, his fingers working quickly to undo the frozen leash. The second it snapped free, the dog let out a weak, shuddering breath, his body sagging forward as if the weight of his suffering had finally been lifted. David's heart clenched. Whoever had left him here had meant for him to die. But they had underestimated one thing. This dog refused to give up. Lifting the frail body into his arms, David stood, the storm raging around them. But this time, the wind no longer carried the cries of a helpless soul. Because he had been heard, because help had arrived, and because, despite everything, this was not the end. It was only the beginning. David could feel the dog's frail body trembling in his arms, his breath barely rising in weak, uneven gasps. The storm had stolen so much from him, his warmth, his strength, his will to fight. But not his life. Not yet. The bitter wind lashed against David's face as he struggled through the knee-deep snow, his own body protesting against the brutal cold. The German shepherd was barely conscious, his head resting limply against David's chest. Every step felt like a battle, but there was no turning back. This wasn't just a rescue anymore, it was a race against death. Even as David carried him, his mind kept going back to that frozen leash, the cruel restraint that had kept the dog bound in place, left to endure the storm's fury with no escape. Someone had tied him there, abandoned him to the mercy of nature's wrath, knowing full well what would happen. The thought made David's blood boil. Who could do this? Who could look into this dog's eyes, see his loyalty, his devotion, and still cast him aside like he was nothing? But that leash was gone now. The chains of suffering had been broken. And as the shepherd let out a soft, barely audible sigh against David's jacket, it almost felt like he knew. Like, for the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, he wasn't alone. The truck felt impossibly far away. The storm was relentless, blinding him with every step. David's muscles burned. His breath came in ragged bursts, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The dog's weight was shifting in his arms, growing heavier. His breathing was slowing. Panic surged through David's veins. No, not now. Not when he was so close. Finally, his truck came into view, a hazy silhouette through the storm. He forced himself forward, his legs screaming in protest, until he reached the door and yanked it open. The warmth inside was weak, but it was better than the hellish cold outside. David eased the dog onto the passenger seat, his hands working fast. He cranked the heat, grabbed an old blanket from the back seat, and wrapped the shepherd in it, rubbing his fur to create some kind of warmth. "Stay with me, buddy," he murmured, his voice tight with urgency. The dog's eyes flickered open for a second, glassy, tired, but still there. A flicker of life. A chance. David threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. The drive felt endless. The snow-covered roads were slick and treacherous, but David's hands never left the wheel, his focus unshakable. Every few seconds, he'd steal a glance at the shepherd beside him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. But doubt gnawed at him. Was he too late? Had the cold done too much damage? He clenched his jaw. No, there was still hope. As the truck sped through the storm, heading toward the nearest veterinary clinic, David refused to think of the worst. Because for the first time since that distant cry had reached his ears, he wasn't listening to the howling blizzard anymore. He was listening to the steady, fragile breathing of the dog beside him. And that sound meant only one thing. He was still fighting. The storm had passed, but its impact remained. For the German shepherd, survival had been the first battle. Now the true test began, the journey toward healing, toward trust, and toward the life he had nearly lost. David sat beside the dog's kennel at the clinic, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. The vets had done everything they could, but now it was up to him. Would he fight to come back? Would he choose to live? David had no doubt. This dog wasn't a victim. He was a warrior. The first few days were uncertain. The shepherd was weak, his body ravaged by frostbite and starvation. But there was something in his eyes, something that told everyone he wasn't ready to give up. Small victories turned into milestones. The first time he lifted his head. The first time he ate without needing help. The first time he tried to stand on shaky legs, refusing to let the past define him. David was there through it all. Every late-night visit, every whispered word of encouragement, every moment where doubt crept in, only to be crushed by the dog's sheer willpower. He was healing, slowly, miraculously, against all odds. Weeks passed, and the dog who had once been left for dead was now standing on his own, his strength returning. His coat, once dull and lifeless, now had a shine to it. His eyes, once clouded with pain, now held something else, determination. He still flinched at sudden movements. He still hesitated when someone reached for him too quickly. But he was learning to trust again, learning that not all humans were like the one who had betrayed him. And David? He knew he couldn't walk away. This dog had fought too hard, survived too much. So when the day came for the clinic to ask about rehoming, David didn't hesitate. He already has a home, but one question still remained: who had done this? David couldn't forget the image of the frozen leash, the cruel way the dog had been abandoned in the storm. Someone had meant for him to die, and that someone needed to be held accountable. He started asking questions, checking nearby shelters for reports of missing shepherds, talking to locals, scanning lost and found ads, looking for anything that might lead him to the person who had left the dog to suffer. And then a breakthrough, a neighbor recalling an argument, a name whispered in guilt, a history of neglect. David knew this wasn't over. The dog had been given a second chance. But now justice had to be served, because no animal deserved to suffer the way he had. And no person who could do such a thing should ever be allowed to do it again. The journey had been long. From the moment that desperate cry for help had pierced through the raging blizzard, to the fight for survival, to the search for justice, this German shepherd had endured more than most could imagine. But now, as the storm faded into memory, something else took its place. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, the shepherd wasn't just surviving. He was living. David had never planned on adopting a dog. His life had been busy, filled with work and responsibilities. But plans didn't matter anymore, not when fate had already decided for him. The first time the shepherd wagged his tail at him, weak but hopeful, David knew. They belonged together. The paperwork was signed, the clinic gave their blessing, and just like that, a dog who had once been left for dead now had something he never thought he'd find again: a family. The first night at David's home was quiet. The shepherd hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure if he was really allowed inside. But with a gentle nudge, David reassured him. This was his home now. Days turned into weeks, and the shepherd, now named Blaze, blossomed into a dog unrecognizable from the weak, frozen soul David had found in the snow. His once dull coat now shone in the sunlight. His eyes, which had once held only fear, now sparkled with mischief and trust. He ran through fields with boundless energy, chased after birds, and even slept soundly by David's side. Something he had never been able to do before, because for the first time he felt safe. But most of all, he never let David out of his sight. He had been abandoned once. He had suffered in silence, left to die in the cold. But now he knew he would never be alone again. Blaze's story spread far and wide. Animal rescue groups shared his tale, and soon, people from all over reached out, moved by what he had endured and overcome. Some wept at the cruelty he had faced. Others cheered for the hero who had saved him. But all of them walked away with something more: a lesson about kindness, about responsibility, about the unwavering loyalty of a dog, and the cruelty of those who betray it. Blaze had fought to survive, but he had also fought to prove something greater: that no soul, no matter how broken, is ever truly beyond saving. And as David watched his once-forgotten dog curl up by the fireplace, warm and safe at last, he smiled, because against all odds, Blaze had found his way home. Blaze's story is just one of many. Every day, countless animals are abandoned, left to suffer at the hands of those who were meant to love them. But we have the power to change that. If the story moved you, don't let it end here. Support your local animal shelters. Speak up against neglect and cruelty. If you see an animal in distress, be their voice, because sometimes one act of kindness can mean the difference between life and death. And if you're ready to open your heart, consider adopting a rescue. Just like Blaze, there are countless animals waiting for a second chance. A chance to know love, to feel safe, and to finally find their forever home. Because every life matters, and together we can make a difference.